Monticello is now in session. The Honorable Martin Oliveri presiding. Be seated.
Is the prosecution ready?
You are, Your Honor.
Is the defense ready?
The defense is ready, Your Honor.
Very well. The prosecution may open to the jury.
Thank you, Your Honor. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I'd like to thank you, too, for being here. That seems funny to you? I know. According to our jury system, everyone thinks that you were required to be here, but that's not really true. I mean, if you would have expressed some prejudice against this case, you would have been dismissed, and you would have been spared the difficult task which lies before you. But none of you expressed that prejudice. All of you said that you would be willing to decide the innocence or guilt of Draper Scott, the defendant, despite the fact that you knew that your verdict might send a man of good reputation, a father soon, and a husband, away from his home and family and from the friends that he knows, from the career that he's made for himself, from the life that he knows. Now, that's a great responsibility. All of you knew that that might be the most difficult decision you've ever had to make in your life. And yet, you said that you would be willing to make that decision if, when you're shown the facts, you felt beyond a reasonable doubt that Draper Scott, in a moment of uncontrolled anger, seized the nearest weapon at hand and bludgeoned to death Margot Huntington Dorn, the mother of his wife. Now, if you believe this to be true after I show you the facts, that Draper Scott did commit this murder, then you're required by law to say that you believe that. And that's all. Now, the difficult task of deciding punishment falls on the shoulders of Judge Oliveri, not you. All the prosecution asks of you is that you listen to the evidence with an open mind, that you hear the testimony of the witnesses we bring before you, and that you decide this case on the basis of the facts, not the personalities involved. Now, if you do this, we feel you'll be able to reach this difficult decision without fear of making a mistake. Now, these are the facts of the case. On the night of January 25th, Draper Scott telephoned his mother-in-law, Margot Huntington Dorn, at her home at 123 Rivershore Drive, from his home in Oakdale, a suburb of Monticello. He had just returned from New York. He was angered over the fact that Mrs. Dorn had had some apparent interference in his career as an attorney. That interference we'll outline for you later. Now, he asked Mrs. Dorn if he could meet with her. She said she would do this in an hour's time because she had some errand to run. Mr. Scott then left his house, went to Mrs. Dorn's apartment building, arriving at 7:45 by his own admission. He then parked his car in front of the apartment building and waited for Mrs. Dorn to return. When he saw her enter the building, he followed her in, just missing her elevator by a minute or two. Now, the doorman said that he could go right up, that she was expecting him without being announced. This Mr. Scott did. Within 10 minutes, Draper Scott was on the telephone to the police emergency services asking for an ambulance. And when the police and the paramedics arrived, they discovered Mrs. Dorn gravely injured from a blow to the head administered by a piece of fireplace equipment found beside her. There was no one else in the apartment. That is by Mr. Scott's own statement. Now, because the service elevator was locked, the only entrance or exit to that apartment was through the one private elevator, which ascends directly to the penthouse only. Now, we would like you to weigh these facts carefully and to judge these facts objectively and make your decision on the basis of these facts alone and not the personalities involved. And if you do that, we see only one logical, rational verdict. Thank you. That was fabulous. That was just the right amount of diplomatic restraint, huh? Pretty good.
Mr. Karr, you may open to the jury.
Thank you, Your Honor. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the prosecuting attorney has correctly stated that the most important ingredient in this case, as in every trial, is fact. We, too, will deal only in the known facts when we present our case for the defense. But there are circumstances surrounding the death of Margot Dorn which are still clouded in mystery. There are questions that we cannot answer any more than the police investigation was able to answer them. But we intend to prove that Draper Scott, an intelligent, compassionate, civilized young man, did not suddenly revert to savagery because he was upset with his wife's mother, that he did not lose every ounce of the common sense and decency with which he was blessed all his life, to the point of a brutal attack on a helpless woman. Of course, it is true that even gentle, mild-mannered, so-called decent men and women have been driven to acts of violence, and I'm sure the prosecution will point that out to you. But these examples of reversion to the beast do not indicate that a similar transformation took place in the heart and mind of Draper Scott. Despite the circumstantial evidence the prosecution will present to you, we will convince you that Draper Scott did not commit this crime. And the witness who will prove that to your satisfaction is Draper Scott himself. Thank you.
Mr. Nelson, are you ready to call your first witness?
Sir, we are. The prosecution would like to call Sergeant Samuel Dwyer.
Sergeant Samuel Dwyer, please take the stand.
Place your left hand on the Bible and raise
Nancy,
your right
who is
hand.
that man?
You solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth,
Police
and nothing
officer?
but the truth, so help you God?
How do we know him?
State your name.
Sam Dwyer.
Frankly, I don't. Looks very familiar to me.
Sergeant Dwyer, what's your occupation?
I'm connected with the Monticello Police Department, plainclothes squad.
Yes. How many years?
8 years, first 5 in uniform.
Where were you on the night of January 25th?
I was at 123 Rivershore Drive questioning one of the tenants about a missing persons case. Turned out to be the wrong party.
Well, then how did you get involved with the crime in the penthouse?
Well, just as I was leaving the building, the paramedics arrived, and I thought I'd better check it out.
And when you entered the penthouse, what did you see?
2 people. A woman lying on the floor in front of the terrace, and a young man.
Nobody else?
Nobody else. Just the lady and Mr. Scott.
Nicole, I feel faint. Are you sure you're all right?
I never met the lady.
Maybe
but I
you shouldn't
had
stay.
heard of her.
Nancy, I've got
What
to
about the
stay.
defendant, Draper Scott?
It's okay.
Oh, I've seen Mr. Scott around police headquarters on and off, and once in the district attorney's office, Mr. Swift's office.
Were you aware of the fact that the defendant, Draper Scott, was a son-in-law of Mrs. Dorn?
I don't guess I knew that at the time, but I found it out during questioning.
I see. Could you please tell us what you did right after you saw the body on the floor and Mr. Scott over it?
Well, the first thing I did was call police headquarters and let them know what had happened. Then I made another telephone call.
Oh, to whom?
To another police officer, Detective Steve Guthrie.
Why did you call Detective Guthrie?
Well, Mr. Scott mentioned his name, said he was a friend of his, and I thought Mr. Scott could use a friend.
So then the defendant was very shaken up, obviously upset.
Yes, he was in pretty bad shape, white as a ghost.
But not completely white. Well, you stated in your statement that his hands were dirty.
That's not something I noticed.
Yes, of course. That was Detective Guthrie who noticed that. It was
Objection, Your Honor. The prosecution is introducing evidence not verified by this witness.
Your Honor, I would gladly produce Detective Guthrie, but the defense knows as well as I do that Detective Guthrie is out of the state on police business. However, he did issue a statement, and this witness will confirm it.
Objection overruled.
Thank you, Your Honor. In that statement, he says that the defendant, Draper Scott's right hand was covered with fireplace soot. Isn't that correct?
Well, Mr. Scott said that he had picked up another fireplace tool when he thought he heard someone on the terrace.
Sergeant Dwyer, that is not the question that I asked you.
That's what he said, just the same.
Yes, of course. Let's proceed to the question of the weapon, all right? There was a weapon.
Yes, there was a fireplace tool on the floor right next to Mrs. Dorn's body.
Are you sure that that was the murder weapon?
No doubt about it. There was blood on it. But no fingerprints.
Yes. Well, I'm sure that someone of your police expertise would agree that an instrument like this could have the fingerprints wiped off quite easily. Don't you think?
I guess so.
Is this the murder weapon?
Yes, it's got my mark on it.
I don't know, so it does. Well, Your Honor, we'd like to admit this into evidence. Exhibit A.
We have no objection, Your Honor.
The evidence will be so marked.
Sergeant, did Mr. Scott volunteer any information to you as to how this affair occurred? Any explanation as to what happened?
No, he didn't seem to have any idea. Well, he seemed pretty much out of it.
So the defendant was upset. He was not in control of what he was doing or saying, correct?
What I mean is that, well, he was in a state of shock. He didn't know what had happened. He didn't know how anybody could have done this to his
Sergeant,
mother-in-law,
please,
especially
just
since
answer
they
the
had come up
questions
a
that I
minute.
direct to you, please.
I thought that's what I was doing.
Yes, of course you did. No more questions.
Sergeant Dwyer, on direct examination, you testified that there were no fingerprints on the murder weapon.
That's correct.
Now, the prosecution has implied that Mr. Scott wiped his prints off that murder weapon. Given your long years of experience on the police force, Sergeant, if Mr. Scott had wiped his prints off that murder weapon, wouldn't it have been logical for him to also have wiped the soot off his hands at the same time?
I suppose so.
Did Mr. Scott tell you or Detective Guthrie why his hands were covered with soot?
Well, he did say that he had picked up another fireplace tool when he thought he heard someone on the terrace. And he said when he got out there, he found a plant that had fallen over.
Ah. What were the weather conditions like on the night of January 25th? Do you recall?
Yes, it was quite windy and very cold.
So the wind could have knocked over that plant, creating the noise that Mr. Scott heard.
Yes, that's a very great possibility.
Considering the fact that he had just discovered the body of a woman who had obviously been attacked by someone, hearing a noise, realizing that he might have been in danger himself, wouldn't it have been logical for him to pick up something to protect himself?
Your Honor, I object. Mr. Dwyer, or Sergeant Dwyer, was not there at the time. Mr. Karr is just asking for an opinion, not fact.
Sustained.
I have no more questions, Your Honor. Thank you, sir.
The witness may step down. The prosecution may call its next witness.
Your Honor, the prosecution would like to call Oscar Miller.
Oscar Miller, please take the stand. Place your left hand on the Bible and raise your right hand. You solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I certainly do.
State your name.
Oscar Miller.
Be seated.
Mr. Miller, what's your occupation?
Head doorman.
How many doormen are there at 123 Rivershore Drive?
There are 4 of us on my side of the building, sir. 3 8-hour shifts and 1 relief man, in case one of us gets sick.
Yes. On the night of January 25th, what shift were you working?
The night shift. I generally work nights. Pays a little more.
How long have you worked at the building?
Oh, ever since the place opened about 3.5, 4 years ago.
Well, then you know everyone. Your job is to admit people upstairs and to be in charge of the security.
That's right.
Now, is it true that there are 3 passenger elevators on your side?
Yes, sir. 2 for all the tenants on the floors below the penthouse, and 1 private elevator that goes up to the penthouse only.
So the penthouse elevator went straight up to Mrs. Dorn's apartment
Right.
without stopping on any floors.
Of course, there are 2 service elevators, but they are always locked up tight after 6 p.m.
You mean that on the night in question, the only way for Mrs. Dorn or any other visitor to get into that apartment was via this elevator?
Yes, sir. There only was 1 visitor,
Go ahead.
Mr. Scott. Look, I don't want to do this. I really like Mr. Scott. and I don't...
Your Honor.
Sustained. Mr. Miller, please do not volunteer. Just answer the questions put to you by these attorneys.
Yes, sir. I'm sorry.
Mr. Miller, if it's any consolation, none of us really want to do this, but we have to. Now, will you please tell me what time you saw Mrs. Dorn enter the building?
Well, I didn't look at my watch or anything, but I'm pretty sure it was just about 5 minutes before 8.
And Mr. Scott?
Oh, not 1 minute after. Maybe 2.
Yes.
At the most.
Could you please tell me what Mrs. Dorn said to you?
She said, Oscar, I'm expecting my son-in-law at any moment. Just send him right up.
And when Mr. Scott arrived, you sent him right up.
Right up, that's right.
Did you notice anything unusual about his demeanor?
Well, he was wearing a dark overcoat, no hat.
No.
His-
Mr. Miller, no. Not his appearance. I meant his attitude or his manner.
Oh, yes, oh, yeah, he looked real angry. I remember I said to Dennis, I said, he's the new doorman, he was just leaving to go home. I said, hey, did you see that one? That's the penthouse son-in-law. Didn't he look like the wrath of God? That's just what I said.
The wrath of God. Thank you very much. I have no further questions.
Mr. Karr?
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Miller, during your direct examination, the word security was mentioned. The fact is, you are not a security guard, are you?
No, sir. I'm a doorman. The head doorman.
And in fact, your duties do not require you to screen anyone who comes into that building, take their names, or even note the time of their arrival.
No, sir, all I gotta do is announce them.
Are you absolutely certain that only 1 or 2 minutes passed between the time that Margot Dorn arrived and Draper Scott followed?
Maybe even less time than that.
Are you a good judge of elapsed time, Mr. Miller?
Yes, sir, I think I am.
You realize that it's rather difficult for people to tell exactly how much time has passed between events, don't you?
I don't have any doubt about it. The elevator door was practically just closed when Mr. Scott came in, breathing fire like a dragon.
Mr. Miller, I did not ask you about Mr. Scott's demeanor.
No, sir.
Mr. Miller.
Sorry about that.
Mr. Miller, could you tell me how much time you think has elapsed between the time I've started this examination?
Pardon?
How long do you estimate I've been standing here talking to you?
Well, I guess I could estimate that. I'd say a couple minutes. No, make it 3 or 4.
3 or 4 minutes. You'll have to take my word for this, Mr. Miller, but I began this stopwatch when I began cross-examining you. As you can see, only about 1 minute has passed. That's all.
Well, it sure seemed longer to me. Maybe that's because I'm, a little nervous.
Yes, I can understand why you would be, Mr. Miller. Yeah. No more questions, Your Honor.
Witness may step down. Please call your next witness, Mr. Nelson.
Certainly, Your Honor. Prosecution would like to call Dr. Bruce Corwin.
Dr. Bruce Corwin to the stand.
Excuse me.
Why do they have to call him? Isn't he the doctor that was taking care of Margaret? Yes.
Place your left hand on the Bible and raise your right hand. Solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Dr. Corwin, can you describe the injury to Margot Dorn?
It was a skull fracture.
Was death instantaneous?
No, it wasn't. Perhaps the blow was slightly glancing or didn't have tremendous force behind it. However, there was a very great deal of intracranial pressure, which we were unable to relieve. And death followed approximately 48 hours later.
Did she ever recover consciousness?
Actually, there was a very brief period of consciousness, highly unusual in such cases. I would say that Mrs. Dorn had a great will to live.
Well, during these brief periods of consciousness, did she speak?
She made a few incoherent sounds.
But wasn't there one time when the sounds she made were quite clearly coherent?
There was a moment when she made an audible sound, which I suppose you could call speech.
When was this?
It was during a visit from her daughter. Her daughter was constantly at her bedside, so visit may not be the appropriate word.
Was anyone else there at the time?
Yes, I was there.
All right, then, Doctor, you please tell the jury exactly what April Scott asked her mother and what her mother replied.
Objection, Your Honor. Instead of hearsay evidence, why doesn't Mr. Nelson question the party directly involved?
Your Honor, the doctor stated that he was there. How much more directly involved can you be?
I'll deny the objection.
Thank you, Your Honor. Go ahead, Doctor. What did April Scott say?
I'm sorry. I didn't hear you.
I said, what did April Scott say?
She desperately wanted her mother to speak, to say something. Something that would exonerate her husband.
That seems only natural. Can you remember the exact way that she phrased the question? Now, carefully.
She said, tell them Draper is innocent.
Draper is innocent. Now, what was the answer?
Mrs. Dorn
Dr.
said...
Corey, please speak up for the jury.
Yes, I'm sorry. Mrs. Dorn said, no.
Draper is innocent, and the answer was no. Is that correct?
Yes. Mrs. Dorn said, no.